Princess Alara stood in the center of the high court, her violet markings burning with a lethal intensity as she raised the ritual blade over the kneeling Duke Malachar. Silence gripped the spire, colder than the void between stars. Her hand did not tremble. The Empress watched, breath caught, seeing her broken heir finally claim the power of life and death. Would you risk your entire empire's legacy for the sake of one defective child? A heavy medical scanner sat idle on the silk sheets of the royal bedchamber. 5 months before the steel met Malachar's neck, the hardest reality in the prism spire was the quiet hum of failing luminant science. Beneath the crystalline arches of the spire, I watched the Empress pace. Her robes, woven from solar threads, shimmered with every frantic step. For 3 centuries, our people had equated genetic continuity with the right to rule. If your blood did not sing with the potential of 1,000 future generations, you were a ghost in a crown. Princess Alara was that ghost. The luminant physicians, with their light-based surgeries and cellular perfection, had reached a wall they could not climb. They spoke of her sterility as a biological failure, a terminal glitch in a line of gods. The Empress stopped by the window, her jaw set so tight the tendons in her neck stood out like wires. She was a woman who had conquered moons but could not command her daughter's womb to ignite. It was in this atmosphere of quiet desperation that the Terran vessel arrived. They were rough-edged creatures, their ships smelling of recycled grease and ancient combustion. They did not understand the sanctity of the genetic song. To them, a body was not a temple of perfection, it was a machine that required maintenance, which meant their medicine was fundamentally different. Luminant science focused on the ideal, discarding anything that fell short of the blueprint. The Terrans, however, thrived on the erratic. They studied the mutation, the scar, and the adaptation. During a secret audience in the lower gardens, I observed the Empress meeting with a Terran medic named Dr. Eris Vance. The man looked like he had been assembled from spare parts, but his eyes were sharp. He suggested that Alara's condition wasn't a failure of her biology, but a conflict between her unique chemistry and our rigid medical standards. He offered a trade routes for a chance to look at the princess. Empress Alara's desperation led to a radical move. She didn't just invite a doctor, she arranged a political union. Kaylin Ward, a Terran volunteer with a background in biomechanical engineering, was brought into the spire as a consort monitor. The noble houses, led by the increasingly vocal Duke Malachar, whispered of contamination. They saw the Terran as a parasite in the royal halls. Kaylin was a man of startling patience. He spent his first weeks in the spire not in the throne room, but in a small, improvised laboratory near the princess's private quarters. He never forced himself into her presence. Instead, he practiced a ritual of quiet offerings. Outside Alara's door, on a small pedestal of moonstone, he began to leave items. First, it was a simple Terran flower, its petals a stubborn, earthy red. Then he left a stack of translated Terran philosophy books. They were bound in rough leather, looking utterly out of place against the polished glass of the spire. And she began to watch him from the shadows of her balcony. She was broken, or so the world had told her. But the Terran didn't seem to notice the defect the way the Duke did. From my post in the archives, I watched through the security lenses as Kaylin worked. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. Subscribe for more tales of humanity's impact on the stars. One evening, Alara finally stepped through her door while he was still setting down a book. I saw her hand reach out, her fingers hovering just inches above the leather binding. Her violet markings, usually dim with the weight of her chronic pain, flickered with a sudden, sharp curiosity. Kaylin didn't bow. He didn't look away. He simply nodded, as if her presence was the most natural thing in the universe. The treatments were a slow, methodical rejection of luminant perfection. Kaylin Ward used Terran biorhythms to stabilize her neural flares, replacing our high-intensity light arrays with physical chemistry. Within weeks, the princess began to walk the gardens without the aid of a hovering light cradle. Her violet markings shifted from a jagged, painful electricity to a soft, steady glow. She wasn't just healing, she was changing. which meant the genetic lock wasn't a wall, just a puzzle with a Terran key. One night, I found her in the library, the worn leather of the Terran philosophy books cradled in her lap. She wasn't reading about medicine. She was reading about a world where worth was earned through action, not granted by birth. It was a dangerous thought in a spire built on legacy. When the news finally broke that Alara was carrying a child, the spire didn't celebrate. It trembled. A hybrid life was an affront to every noble house that had spent centuries refining their blood. Duke Malachur didn't wait for the birth. He struck during the Festival of Zenith, a poison dart aimed at Kalen as he crossed the outer promenade. He wanted to remove the contaminant before it could take root. But Kalen survived, and the rage that woke in Alara was something the spire had never seen. It wasn't the refined, cold anger of an empress. It was a primal, physical fury. She didn't call for guards. She called for a trial in the High Court, dragging the conspiracy into the white light of the spire's heart. The court was hers. A sharp click. The sound of the ritual blade locking into place echoed against the glass pillars. And so, we returned to the silence of the High Court, back to that frozen moment where Alara stood over the traitor. The blade did not waver. As the steel descended, the Duke's screams were cut short by the absolute finality of royal justice. The court stood paralyzed, watching their defective princess claim the ultimate right of a ruler. The labor began hours later, a grueling, 14-hour siege against her own biology. The luminant doctors hovered, terrified by the anomaly, while Kalen stayed by her head. He whispered words in a language the spire had never heard, words of endurance and stubbornness. When the first cry finally broke the silence, it sounded like a new era beginning. She was perfect. Empress Solara entered the room alone, her solar robes dimmed by the long night. She looked at the child, then at the daughter she had once considered a failure. The Empress didn't speak of genetics or continuity. She simply knelt by the bed, her hand trembling as she touched the hybrid markings on the infant's cheek. It was an acknowledgement of a debt she could never fully repay. The decree was issued that same night. The spire would no longer be a monument to the perfection of the past, but a forge for the future. In the quiet of the nursery, the leather-bound books remained on the bedside table. Alara traced the title of a Terran volume with one finger, her eyes fixed on her sleeping daughter, Lyra. The spire was still made of glass, but the light hitting it now was different. It was warmer. It was earned.